Julio Vargas's mansion sat high in the hills, surrounded by high walls, hidden cameras, and men in suits patrolling the gates day and night. From afar, it looked like just another luxurious property belonging to a powerful man. But those who entered felt the heavy air, the kind of silence that screams. Julio was known in the underworld as the Bull, the man who never made mistakes. Calculating, he owned half the city and all the fears it harbored. A man who controlled everything, except his own home, since his wife Elena had died under suspicious circumstances and the house had become a mausoleum. Curtains always drawn, steps restrained, and an 8-year-old boy who rarely smiled. Julio's son, Leo, had been diagnosed as deaf since he was a baby. No doctor had been able to change that diagnosis, and little by little, the boy had become just another ghost in the house. Julio was trying to convince himself that silence was protection, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, he swore he could hear his son's muffled crying coming from upstairs. The employees constantly rotated shifts. No one stayed for more than 2 weeks. Some said the boy was strange, that he stared intently at people as if he wanted to speak. Others claimed he made meaningless gestures and became irritated when he wasn't understood. But there was one detail that everyone avoided mentioning aloud. The boy looked like scared, not with Julio, but with something inside that house. One morning, while Julio was reviewing reports on his illegal dealings in the office, the head of the domestic team knocked on the door. "Mr. Vargas, the new employee has arrived." Julio looked up. "New employee?" "Yes, sir. The agency sent a replacement for the child safety and maintenance position." Julio frowned, not remembering having approved any hiring, but gestured for them to be let in. The door opened, revealing Anastasia Herrera. She wore simple clothes, black pants, a light-colored shirt, her hair elegantly tied back. She had a firm gaze, but a serenity that contrasted with the somber atmosphere of the mansion. Julio analyzed her for several long seconds. "I thought they would send a security guard, not a nanny." Anastasia held his gaze. "They sent someone who understands people, Mr. Vargas, especially difficult children." He leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "And who said my son is difficult?" She didn't answer immediately. She just walked to the window and looked at the garden where Leo was playing alone, kicking nothing with a broken toy car in his hands. "No one is born difficult, Mr. Vargas. Sometimes they just don't have anyone to listen to them." Julio wasn't used to hearing that kind of audacity in his own home. Something about it irritated him and intrigued him at the same time. "Do whatever you want," he said finally. "Just don't bother me with sentimentality." Anastasia nodded and left without another word. That first night, Anastasia barely slept. She lay in the small room designated for domestic staff on the ground floor, listening to the sounds of the mansion, or rather, the absence of them. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Around 3 in the morning, she heard it, a muffled whimper, like a wounded animal trying not to be heard. It came from upstairs. She rose quietly, padding barefoot through the darkened hallways, following the sound until she reached Leo's door. Through the crack, she could see the boy curled up in bed, his small hands clutching his left ear, his face contorted in pain. A faint blue light pulsed rhythmically beside his pillow, some kind of device charging on the nightstand. The boy's lips moved silently, forming words no one would hear, tears streaming down his face. Anastasia's heart clenched. She'd seen this before. 3 years ago, in São Paulo, she had worked for the Montero family. They had a daughter, Isabella, 6 years old, with bright eyes and an infectious laugh. The family was wealthy, influential, desperate to cure their daughter's hearing loss. A man had come to them, smooth-talking and confident, promising a revolutionary treatment. His name was Dr. Henrique Rato, and he represented a company called Biosyntech Technologies. The device was sleek, expensive, state-of-the-art. The Monteros signed every waiver, paid every fee, convinced they were giving their daughter a miracle. For the first week, Isabella seemed better. She responded to sounds, turned when called. The family celebrated, but then the seizures started. Small at first, tremors in her hands, brief moments of disorientation. Then they became violent, unpredictable. Anastasia had been there the day Isabella collapsed in the garden, convulsing on the grass, while the device in her ear emitted a high-pitched whine that made everyone's teeth ache. The ambulance came too late. By the time they removed the device, Isabella's brain had suffered irreversible damage. She died 3 days later, surrounded by machines that couldn't save her and parents who couldn't comprehend how their hope had become their daughter's death sentence. At the funeral, Isabella's mother had pressed a small medal into Anastasia's hand, a saint's medallion the girl had always worn. "Find out who did this," the woman had whispered, her voice raw from screaming. "Promise me you'll find them." Anastasia had made that promise. She spent months researching, following threads through medical forums, reaching out to other families who'd been approached by Biosyntech. The company was a ghost. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, partnerships that dissolved before anyone could investigate. But one name kept appearing in the margins: Julio Vargas, not as a perpetrator, but as a client. Another desperate father with a deaf child and unlimited resources. When the employment agency contacted her about a position at the Vargas mansion, Anastasia knew it wasn't coincidence. She'd made sure her resume landed on the right desks, dropped the right hints to the right people. She needed to get inside that house. She needed to see if another child was dying the same way Isabella had. Now, watching Leo suffer in the darkness, she knew her instincts had been correct. The device was here, the same blue light, the same tortured expression, the same silent agony. In the following days, Anastasia observed the household routine with meticulous attention. The boy lived in isolation, always accompanied by a nurse named Carla, who followed strict orders. Everything was controlled: schedules, meals, playtime. No loud noises, no questions. Carla changed the device in Leo's ear every morning, a fresh one from a locked medical cabinet in the hallway. She logged the serial numbers in a leather-bound notebook, her expression vacant and professional. Anastasia learned the pattern. Carla took her lunch break at 1 o'clock, always leaving the cabinet keys on the hook by the kitchen. The security cameras had a 7-second rotation blind spot in the upstairs hallway. 7 seconds to pick a lock, retrieve a device, and disappear. But Anastasia began to notice something else too. Leo wasn't just suffering. He was trying to communicate. Every gesture had intention. He would touch his left ear with his index finger, then thump his chest with his fist, over and over, whenever someone came near. Most people thought it was just a nervous tic, a manifestation of his frustration. But Anastasia saw the desperation in his eyes. He was asking for help. The sign was crude, instinctive, but unmistakable. Pain in the ear, pain in the chest. The device was hurting him, and he'd been trying to tell someone for God knows how long. One afternoon, she found him hiding behind a curtain in the library, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He looked at her, startled, and hid the paper behind his back. "It's okay, Leo," she said softly, crouching to his level. "I'm not going to take anything from you." The boy hesitated, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, slowly, he handed over the paper. They were scribbled drawings, crude but detailed. An outline of an ear with jagged lines radiating from it. A tear falling from a closed eye, and something that looked like an electrical outlet or perhaps a charging station. At the bottom, scratched over and over until the pencil had torn through the paper. "Help." Anastasia felt a shiver run down her spine. "What's that, Leo?" she asked, but the boy just pointed to his ear and then upstairs toward his father's office. She understood. The answers were in Julio's room. That evening, she waited until the mansion settled into its nightly rhythm. Julio had left for a meeting downtown, his convoy of black cars disappearing down the hill. The security staff changed shifts at 10, a 15-minute window of reduced surveillance. Anastasia moved through the house like a shadow, her footsteps silent on the marble floors. Julio's office was locked, but she'd spent years working in homes where secrets were currency. A hairpin and 30 seconds was all it took. Inside, the room smelled of leather and expensive cologne. A massive desk dominated the space, covered in ledgers and encrypted phones. But Anastasia's attention was drawn to the far wall, where a small safe was built into the paneling, the same one where Julio kept his most sensitive documents and his personal weapon. The safe door was slightly ajar. Someone had been careless, or perhaps confident, that no one would dare enter this room. Anastasia pulled it open. Inside were several items: stacks of cash, a pistol, property deeds. And there, in a velvet-lined box, 3 hearing devices identical to the one Leo wore, each in sterile packaging. She picked one up, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, with a discreet mark engraved on the side: Biosyntech. Her blood ran cold. Beneath the box was a folder, thick with documents. She flipped it open, her hands trembling. Technical specifications, neural frequency modulation charts, consent forms signed in Julio's distinctive scrawl. At the top of one page, printed in clinical typeface, Julio Vargas, Subject 07, Auditory Neuromodulation Protocol, Experimental Phase. The dates went back 2 years. 2 years of Leo wearing this device. 2 years of it sending electrical pulses directly into his auditory nerve and beyond, into the delicate tissues of his developing brain. The notes were chilling. Subject shows increased pain tolerance. Minor behavioral changes noted. Continued monitoring required. Udrit, at the bottom of the file, a business card. Dr. Henrique Rato, Biosyntech Technologies, with a private phone number and an address in the upscale medical district. The same man, the same company, the same nightmare, repeating itself in a different house with a different child. Anastasia's vision blurred with rage. She'd been too late for Isabella, but Leo was still alive. She could still save him. "My God," she whispered. The sound of footsteps in the hallway froze her in place. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. Julio. He'd come back early. Anastasia shoved the file back into the safe, but there was no time to close it, no time to hide. The door swung open, and Julio stood there, his expression cold and assessing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "It's too late for cleaning, Anastasia," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you hiding?" She straightened, meeting his gaze. There was no point in lying now. "Your son is suffering," she said. "This device, it's not normal, it's hurting him." Julio's jaw tightened. "You don't understand anything." "I understand more than you think," she retorted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "This device is altering his brain, and if it continues, it could kill him." Julio stopped, a muscle in his face twitching. "Who are you anyway?" Anastasia took a breath. This was the moment. Someone who has seen the same name before. Biosyntech. Destroy another family. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julio looked away, and in that moment, Anastasia realized the truth. He already knew. He knew what the device was doing, what it had been designed to do. He'd known all along, but had convinced himself it was worth the risk. "They promised me he would be all right," Julio said, his voice cracking, "that the device would cure his deafness, that he'd be normal. And in return, Julio, what did you give them?" she asked. He remained silent, but the answer was written in his eyes: money, power, influence, and his own son. "There's still time to fix it," Anastasia said, lowering her voice. Julio stared at her with a mixture of anger and shame. "You don't know what you're saying. If I mess with this, they'll come after me, and the boy." She took a step closer. "They're already after him. You just haven't realized it yet." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Julio sank into his desk chair, suddenly looking older, diminished. "What do you want me to do?" "Let me remove it," Anastasia said. "Let me take that thing out of his ear and give him a chance to heal." Julio's hands clenched into fists on the desktop. "Ratto said there would be consequences if we stopped the treatment mid-protocol. that Leo's nervous system is now dependent on the frequencies. That's what they want you to believe, Anastasia said. It's how they keep you compliant. They did the same thing to the Montero family, told them that stopping would be dangerous, that they had to continue, and they did, right up until their daughter died on the operating table. Julio's head snapped up. Someone died. A 6-year-old girl named Isabella, Anastasia said quietly. The device caused seizures. By the time they removed it, the damage was done. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small medal Isabella's mother had given her. Her mother gave this to me at the wake, asked me to find the people responsible. That's why I'm here. Julio stared at the medal, his face pale. I didn't know. No, Anastasia said. You didn't ask. That night, Anastasia went to Leo's room. The boy was asleep but restless, his small body trembling with fever, sweat soaking his pillow. The device glowed on the nightstand, pulsing in rhythm with some unseen signal. She sat in the armchair beside his bed and waited. If Julio couldn't save his son, she would. When dawn broke, she made her decision. She gently woke Leo, whose eyes opened with the exhausted look of someone who'd been fighting a war in his sleep. Leo, she whispered, I'm going to help you. This might hurt for a moment, but then it's going to be so much better. Do you trust me? The boy looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Anastasia reached for the device in his ear. It was embedded deeper than she'd expected, with tiny prongs that had fused with the skin of his ear canal. She worked carefully, her hands steady despite the boy's whimpers. Finally, with a soft click, it came free. Leo gasped, his hand flying to his ear. For a moment his eyes went wide with panic, then his body relaxed, the tension draining from his small frame like water from a broken dam. Anastasia didn't hesitate. She took the device to the bathroom and dropped it into a glass of water. Immediately, it began to spark, circuits frying in the liquid, but seconds later every light in the mansion flickered, alarms blared. Doors began locking automatically with heavy metallic thuds. The house's smart system was responding to the device's distress signal. Julio burst into the room, breathless and wild-eyed. What did you do? The glass trembled on the sink, the device inside emitting sparks and a high-pitched whine. Anastasia stepped back, alarmed. See? It's remotely controlled. They've been monitoring him this whole time. Julio stared at the sparking device, comprehension dawning on his face. He grabbed the glass and hurled it against the tile wall. The device exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke, and the alarms immediately fell silent. In the sudden quiet, a sound emerged that made Julio's heart stop. A voice, hoarse, weak, but unmistakably real. Dad, Leo murmured, touching his ear tentatively. The boy was looking at his father with wide, frightened eyes, but he was speaking. For the first time in years, Julio heard his son's voice. Julio fell to his knees beside the bed, his hands trembling as they reached for Leo. You can hear me, he whispered. You can hear yourself. Leo nodded, tears streaming down his face. It hurt, Dad. It hurt so much. The mobster who'd built an empire on fear and violence began to cry, pulling his son into his arms. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Anastasia watched from the doorway, her own eyes burning. The sign had always been there. Leo had been asking for help every single day, and everyone had been too blind or too cowardly to see it. Do you understand now? She asked quietly. He was never deaf, Julio. He was just being tortured into silence. Julio looked up, his face ravaged by tears and fury. Who did this to my son? Anastasia took a breath. The same man who sold you the lie. Ratto. The name echoed in the room like a death sentence. The rain fell heavily that night, pounding against the windows as if trying to force its way inside. In the Vargas mansion, the lights were turned on one by one. Julio didn't want any more shadows, not after hearing his own guilt in his son's weak voice. Ratto, he repeated, standing before the fireplace in his office. Where is he? Anastasia didn't take her eyes off him. Where he's always been when he smells easy money and expensive secrets, behind the scenes. He's the middleman, the man who sells clean solutions to dirty problems. He brought me biosyntech, Julio said, his voice hard. He came to me after Eleanor died, when I was desperate. He knew about Leo's diagnosis. He said he had a solution, something experimental but promising. He promised the device would save Leo, that I could trust it. And I did. You chose to trust, Anastasia said firmly, because it hurt less than seeing your real son. The words were harsh, but necessary. Julio took a deep breath. There was no defense, only one way forward. Let's bring him out into the open, Julio said, picking up his encrypted phone. But my way. The order spread like wildfire through Julio's network. In bars, in alleyways, in hotel lobbies, in the back rooms where deals were made and threats were delivered, the Vargas name became the whisper of a storm. Find Rato. Ports were watched. Warehouses were searched. Front clinics with discreet entrances were put under surveillance. Rats flee into holes. Julio ordered them all sealed. Meanwhile, Anastasia locked herself in Julio's office with the box of evidence. On the lid, the cursed mark, Biosyntech. She spread everything across the massive desk. Papers, printed emails, shipping labels, photographs of the devices. Many documents carried a semicircular signature. R. He left his mark on purpose, she noted. Narcissist. It'll be useful in court, Julio replied curtly. In court and on the street, Anastasia said, pushing a folder toward him. Addresses, storage locations for the devices. And this, she slid over another folder thinner, is personal. Rato's dossier, where he eats, where he sleeps, who he thinks he controls. Julio looked at her with renewed attention. You came too prepared to be just a maid. I came prepared for a boy, Anastasia said, her voice catching slightly. For the first time, she lowered her guard completely. Rato destroyed the family I was caring for. That 6-year-old girl, Isabella. The device caused seizures that the doctors couldn't stop. Her voice faltered. She didn't survive. I promised her mother that if I ever saw that name again, I wouldn't run away. I'd fight. Silence filled the room. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but the silence of understanding. Then don't run, Julio said, holding her gaze. Stay and finish this with me. The following night, 2 of Julio's most trusted men found a lead, a warehouse on the docks, operating as a front for an import company specializing in medical equipment. Boxes marked with the Biosyntech logo. A shipment scheduled to leave at 3 a.m, destination unknown. Julio arrived with 4 cars, headlights off, his men dressed in dark clothes and grim expressions. Anastasia went with them, her hair tied back, her face set with determination. If Rato is there, she said while checking the photographs one more time, he won't wait around to talk. I'm not going to talk either, Julio said, checking his weapon. I'm going to take the truth out of him. The dock smelled of salt and rust and old blood, the scent of places where things happen that no one talks about in daylight. Metal doors, thick padlocks, the sound of voices inside laughing over a card game. Julio signaled with 2 fingers, and his men moved like shadows. The doors burst open with a crash that echoed across the empty harbor. Shouts, arms raised, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Within minutes, the warehouse was secured. Boxes were torn open, revealing rows of devices identical to the one that had nearly killed Leo. Spreadsheets with codes and destinations covered a makeshift desk. A map on the wall showed red dots across the entire country, each one a potential victim. But Rato wasn't there. Clever, Anastasia murmured, running her fingers over the map. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He always leaves behind a manager who can be burned if things go wrong. The warehouse manager was a thin man with nervous eyes and shaking hands. He spoke easily, terrified of the name Vargas and what it meant in these circles. Rato, he said, was at a private clinic in the upscale medical district, top floor, accessible only by a service elevator. That's where they processed the adaptation of the devices, neural calibration, pain tolerance testing, adjustments. Tolerance for what? Julio asked, his voice dangerously quiet. To the pain, Anastasia answered for him, her jaw tight. They measure how much agony a child can endure before the parents notice something's wrong. Julio's hands clenched. Let's go. The clinic had a profile of understated luxury. Glass facade, perfumed reception area with soft music, attendants with trained smiles and designer scrubs. But the service elevator, accessed through a rough concrete garage at the back, led directly to an unmarked door on the top floor. Julio and Anastasia entered using fake ID badges that one of Julio's contacts had provided, good enough to fool the automated systems. The hallway beyond was sterile, white walls that didn't want to remind anyone of a hospital, despite that being exactly what it was. To the left, a glass window revealed a room with examination chairs and monitoring equipment. Inside, a hearing device identical to Leo's sat open on a table, its internal circuitry exposed like the guts of an insect. The door at the end of the hallway opened before they reached it. Expensive leather shoes, light-colored suit, a small smile that didn't reach the eyes. "I thought you were more resilient, Toro," Dr. Henrique Rato said, his voice carrying the soft confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "A deaf child is a blessing in a noisy world, don't you think? Silence is power." Julio took 2 aggressive steps forward, but Anastasia touched his arm, enough pressure to say, "Don't ruin our chance." "Why all this?" Anastasia asked. "To sell patents? To blackmail rich parents? What's the end game?" Rato smiled, but it was a cold expression, reptilian. "To teach that nothing is as expensive as remorse. Guilty people pay more than desperate people ever could." He tilted his head, assessing Anastasia from head to toe. "The maid changed her outfit. You look quite charming when you're not scrubbing floors." Julio's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What did you put in my son's device?" "A convenient truth," Rato said, spreading his arms. "He was the problem, Vargas. A broken child in a broken home. I just gave you an excuse not to look too closely. The device kept him quiet, compliant. Isn't that what you really wanted? A son you didn't have to understand?" That was enough. Julio lunged forward. 2 security guards emerged from side doors. 2 of Julio's men responded instantly. The corridor erupted into violence, fists against flesh, metal against bone. Anastasia didn't hesitate. She pulled the taser from her jacket pocket and dropped one guard with a shot to the knee. The other came at her from above. She twisted, using his momentum to slam him against the glass window. It cracked, spiderwebbing outward. Rato stepped back, still wearing that infuriating smile, the expression of someone who believed there was always another angle, always another escape route. "Do you think you can arrest me with 6 pieces of paper?" he said. "I am the papers. My lawyers will have me out before sunrise." "No," Anastasia said, pulling out her phone. "You are the voice." She touched the screen. The recording played clearly, captured from the moment they'd entered. "Silence is power." The device kept him quiet, compliant. "Isn't that what you really wanted?" Voice, timbre, intent, all of it preserved. Rato's smile finally died. "Who said I came here to hit you?" Julio said, slowly lowering his fist, even as his men subdued the last guard. "I came to silence you, in the only place where you actually make noise, the money." The emergency doors at the end of the hallway burst open. Federal agents, tax prosecutors, a female detective known throughout the underworld for her stubborn refusal to be bought or intimidated. Warrants were served, photographs taken. Rato's offshore accounts began freezing in real time as the Financial Crimes Unit executed the orders Julio had arranged through his own network of compromised officials, calling in every favor, burning every bridge necessary to make this happen. "Did you call the police?" Rato stared at Julio in disbelief, his composure finally shattered. "I called them the moment I heard my son's voice," Julio replied, "and I promised myself something. Never again will I outsource my courage." Rato tried to run, heading for the fire escape, but Anastasia was already there, blocking his path. "The girl was 6 years old," she said softly, pulling out the small, scratched medal. "Remember her? Isabella Montero. Her mother gave this to me at the wake." For a moment, genuine fear flickered across Rato's face. The detective handcuffed him without ceremony. "End of the line, Doctor of Silence." The clinic became a crime scene. The warehouse became evidence. The word biosyntech finally emerged from the shadowy forums and encrypted channels into the harsh light of the evening news. Executives fell. Contracts were voided. Emails that had been sleeping in the cloud were awakened by subpoenas. There were too many families to count. Too many children who'd suffered. High on the hill, the Vargas mansion opened its curtains. Sunlight poured into rooms that had lived in darkness for years. Leo walked down the hallway with short, careful steps, sometimes stopping to touch his ear, out of habit. An old gesture that was no longer a cry for help, just a memory slowly fading. He looked out the windows at the garden, at the city below, and smiled. Julio followed at a respectful distance, feeling stupidly large and clumsy beside his small son, relearning how to be a father instead of a prison warden. "Leo!" he called, his voice trembling with the uncertainty of asking permission. Do you want me to show you the garage? There's an old car down there. It'll fit both of us." Leo turned, hesitated, then nodded slowly, a gesture of peace, of possibility. Anastasia watched from the stairs, arms crossed, wearing a smile that wasn't victory, but rest. She descended, past them, and opened the door to the backyard, letting the sun flood in completely. "Today is a day for beautiful noises," she said. "Music, water from the fountain, footsteps on the lawn. The house will find it strange at first, but it will get used to it." The following week, Julio and Anastasia welcomed other families into the large living room. Fathers with swollen eyes and worn briefcases, mothers whose hope had nearly died, children with fears they were only beginning to understand. A trusted ENT specialist arrived, along with a speech therapist and a lawyer who spoke softly but wrote with devastating precision. The mansion became a meeting place, informal, dangerous to those who'd profited from silence, necessary for those who'd suffered in it. Julio signed checks without negotiation. It wasn't charity, it was debt he was repaying. He discovered that money has two sides, when it buys silence and when it pays for voices to be heard. Ratto tried one last manipulation from his prison cell, sending a veiled message through an expensive lawyer. "Everyone has a glass ceiling, Toro. Even you." Julio replied with 2 lines, "It broke yesterday. Today there's open sky." On Sunday afternoon, Leo had his first lesson with a music teacher who specialized in children learning to hear for the first time. She brought songs that are learned with the body, hands tapping gently on the table, turning the room into a drum. Julio sat in the corner, repeating the rhythms badly and late, laughing at himself, a sound that had been absent from this house for far too long. Anastasia kept time with finger snaps, and Leo followed seriously, concentrating like someone opening a complicated lock, one note after another. "Dad," Leo said, testing the syllable like a key in a door. Julio slowly raised his face. The world stopped at the sound of that word. "I'm here," he replied, and this time he truly was. Anastasia closed her eyes for a moment and thought of Isabella, of the small medal, of the wake that had taught her that anger must learn to speak slowly if it wants to be heard. In the hallway, the detective had left an envelope. The case against Biosyntech was growing exponentially. Signatures from victims, attachments from whistleblowers, reports that painted a picture of systemic abuse. The pleasant noise of justice, slow but inevitable. That night, when the house finally quieted, Julio called Anastasia to his office. No fireplace burned, no expensive whiskey sat on the desk, just 2 cups of coffee and a thin folder. "I want to propose something," he said seriously. "It's not a contract, it's not payment, it's family." She waited, not blinking. "I don't know the right legal term, and I don't want to stumble over big words, but I want Leo to have you in writing. Not as an employee, not as staff, as guardian, with me. If I ever make another mistake, and I will, I want the law to know that you have the same voice over his welfare that I do." Anastasia hesitated before answering. She looked out the window at their reflections side by side, then down the hallway where a pair of small sneakers sat outside Leo's door. "I accept," she said simply, "but on one condition." Julio raised an eyebrow. "Which?" "That you never again run away from the noise. Not his, and not yours." Julio nodded, and there was something boyish in that gesture, a confession that couldn't be contained in bravado or power. Never again. They signed the preliminary documents there, with ordinary pens and trembling hands. It wasn't the final paperwork. That would come with lawyers and judges and time. But at that table, another kind of pact was born. The pact to never again outsource love. Months later, the Biosyntech case reached public hearing. Ratto was brought into the courtroom without his expensive suit, without his confident smile. He tried to look at Julio as if recalling an old game between equals, but the mobster's gaze went straight through him as if he were already a ghost. The prosecutor presented videos, audio recordings, spreadsheets that told the story of systematic exploitation. Anastasia spoke for 5 minutes, and they were the most powerful 5 minutes of the entire session. No tears, no melodrama, just facts that had learned to walk on their own. Finally, the judge's gavel came down. Guilty. Outside, the city breathed differently for a moment, as if acknowledging that sometimes justice arrives late, but arrives nonetheless. That night, the mansion filled with people who had once been strangers, but were now bound by shared trauma and shared victory. There was cake that didn't match the crystal plates, a borrowed dog running across expensive carpets, laughter that bounced off the high ceilings and came back amplified. Julio discovered that luxury isn't what shines in display cases. It's what ignites in your throat when someone calls your name with love. "Mom!" Leo ran to Anastasia with open arms. She laughed while crying because sometimes that's the only honest response the body knows. Julio watched from across the room, feeling his chest warm with a healthy jealousy, the kind that asks for nothing more than to be included. He approached, knelt beside both of them, and the three remained like that for several seconds, testing the firmness of the future with their knees on the ground and their hearts unguarded. "What do we hear now?" Julio asked with gentle humor. "Rock, classical, silence. No to silence," Leo said seriously, and there was a strength in his small voice that hadn't been there before. "Never silence again." And in the large room of a house that had once been a mausoleum, a simple song began, played with clapping, with off-key humming, with the beautiful imperfection of people learning to make noise together. No devices, no codes, no hidden frequencies. Just voices, some out of tune, others arriving late, all of them gloriously, messily alive. 3 years passed, like water finding its level, slow but inexorable. The mansion on the hill transformed from a fortress of silence into something stranger and more wonderful. A home that breathed, that laughed, that sometimes argued but always reconciled. Leo, now 11 years old, had grown into a boy with his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He attended a school for children with diverse communication needs, where he excelled not just academically, but as a bridge between worlds. He taught himself sign language with the same fierce determination he'd once used to survive his torture, and now he volunteered twice a week to help younger children who were just beginning their journey with hearing devices, the legitimate kind, the ones that helped instead of harmed. On a Sunday afternoon in spring, the garden behind the mansion hosted what had become a monthly tradition, a gathering for families affected by medical experimentation, a support group that had grown from a handful of people in a living room to nearly 50 families with stories that echoed and diverged and ultimately converged on the same truth. They had survived, and they would make sure others didn't have to suffer the same way. Julio stood at the outdoor grill of all places, wearing an apron that said, "The Bull Cooks," that one of the kids had given him as a joke. He was arguing good-naturedly with another father about the proper way to season chicken, a conversation that would have been unimaginable in his previous life. His criminal empire had been systematically dismantled, not by law enforcement, but by his own hand. He'd turned state's evidence on several operations in exchange for immunity, using his intimate knowledge of the underworld to close channels that had funded everything from drug trafficking to human exploitation. Some called it redemption. Julio called it payment on a debt that could never be fully settled. Now he ran a foundation, the Elena and Leonardo Vargas Foundation for Medical Ethics, that provided legal support, medical advocacy, and financial assistance to families navigating the nightmare of experimental treatments gone wrong. The irony wasn't lost on him. Anastasia sat at a table with three mothers, reviewing paperwork for an upcoming lawsuit against another medical device company that had been operating in the shadows. She'd completed her certification as a patient advocate and had become the Foundation's Director of Family Services. The small medal that Isabella's mother had given her hung on a chain around her neck, visible above her collar, a reminder of why this work mattered, of the cost of looking away. Leo appeared at her elbow, tugging gently on her sleeve. When she looked down, he signed, "The new family is here. The boy is scared. Can I talk to him?" Anastasia glanced toward the gate, where a car had just pulled up. A couple emerged, looking exhausted and suspicious, followed by a boy about Leo's age who held himself with the rigid tension of someone expecting pain. "Yes," she signed back, "but let him come to you, don't push." Leo nodded and walked to the refreshment table, deliberately placing himself in the new boy's line of sight, but not approaching directly. Within 5 minutes, curiosity overcame fear, and the new boy drifted over. Anastasia watched them begin to communicate, first in halting signs, then with increasing confidence as the new boy realized he'd found someone who understood. By the time the sun began to set, the garden was filled with the cacophony of life, children playing tag between the trees, adults sharing stories and contact information, the clatter of dishes being cleared, and the gentle strumming of a guitar someone had brought. Julio found Anastasia standing slightly apart from the crowd, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm evening. "You're thinking about her," he said quietly. "She didn't ask who. Always. Every child we help, I think about the one I couldn't save. She saved all of them," Julio said, gesturing to the garden. "If you hadn't made that promise to her mother, you wouldn't have come looking for Ratto. You wouldn't have found Leo. None of this would exist." "Maybe," Anastasia said, "or maybe someone else would have done it." "No," Julio said firmly, "not someone else. You. Because you cared enough to remember a little girl's name." Before Anastasia could respond, Leo appeared between them, followed by the new boy. "This is Marco," Leo said aloud, his speech still slightly imprecise but growing clearer every month. "His device hurt him too. I told him about the doctors you found, Mom, the ones who can help." Marco looked at Anastasia with desperate hope. "Can you really make it stop hurting?" She knelt to his level. "Yes, it might take time, and you might need therapy afterward, but yes, the pain stops. I promise you." Marco's eyes filled with tears, and his mother, who'd been hovering anxiously nearby, let out a sound between a sob and a laugh. "Thank you. God, thank you." As the family began discussing next steps with one of the Foundation's medical coordinators, Leo tugged Julio toward the old garage he'd mentioned years ago. Inside sat the restored car, a project they'd worked on together over countless Saturdays, learning to communicate through grease and wrenches when words were still difficult. "Dad," Leo said, running his hand along the hood, "do you think Mom ever gets tired?" "Of what?" "Of fixing broken things, broken people." Julio considered the question seriously. "I think she gets tired sometimes, but I also think she doesn't know how to stop. It's who she is." "Like you don't know how to stop being suspicious of everyone?" Julio laughed, a sound that still surprised him with its unfamiliarity. "Yes, exactly like that. We're all a little broken, Leo. The trick is finding people who think your broken parts fit with theirs." Leo thought about this, then nodded. "That's okay. I like our kind of broken." They returned to the garden as the gathering began to wind down. Families exchanged contact information, promised to meet again, loaded sleepy children into cars. The new family, Marco's family left last, and Anastasia watched their taillights disappear down the hill with the same expression she always wore at this moment. Satisfaction mixed with the fear that she hadn't done enough, could never do enough. Julio stood beside her, their shoulders touching. Leo sat on the steps, teaching the borrowed dog a new trick. The house behind them glowed with warm light. "Do you ever miss it?" Anastasia asked suddenly. "The power, the respect, the fear?" "Every day," Julio admitted. "And then Leo laughs at something, or you tell me I'm being an idiot about something, or I see one of those families drive away with hope they didn't have before, and I realize I don't miss it as much as I think I do." That's not a very satisfying answer. "No," Julio agreed, "but it's true." Anastasia leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "We did something good here, didn't we?" "We did something necessary," Julio corrected. "Good is a bonus." Inside the house, the phone rang, the Foundation's emergency line. Anastasia tensed, then moved to answer it. Julio followed, because this was what they did now. They answered the calls that came in the dark, from desperate people who'd heard there was a place that listened, that helped, that remembered what it meant to be powerless, and decided never to let that happen to someone else, if they could prevent it. Leo came in behind them, the dog at his heels, ready to do whatever was needed, because he'd learned from the two adults who'd saved him that love isn't passive. It's a verb, an action, a choice made over and over again. And in that house on the hill, in the city that spread out below like a carpet of lights and shadows, the noise continued, beautiful, messy, imperfect, alive. The sign had been answered. The silence had been broken, and in its place, something better had grown. The sound of people who'd been lost, learning to call out to each other, learning that their voices mattered, learning that the world was listening. Finally, at last.